Part 1. Chapter 188. Hit looked down at Broly's chest to find it in perfect shape. No crushed heart, not even a wound to speak of was to be seen. Instead, the spot Hit struck was glowing in a milky white light. Hit's expression turned gloomy as he looked at Broly's face again. One Broly was staring at him wide-eyed. A chill went down Hit's spine as he looked at the predator-like eyes. He felt like a sheep that was discovered by a ferocious wolf. Hit immediately jumped back, creating a few hundred meters distance between the two. Suddenly he bumped into something. He spun around without thinking and struck whatever was behind him. His fist was caught by Broly, who had a strange aura around him. Hit felt the pressure coming from Broly's hands grow. It seemed like he was about to crush his hand. Hit yanked out his hand before taking a few steps back. His breathing was jagged, and he noticed that his emotions were in turmoil. He took several deep breaths to calm himself down. Broly didn't show any motions of attacking Hit as he gave him time to stabilize himself. What was that? The shock had already settled, and he couldn't help to ask what just happened to him. Just a mental attack powered by soul and magic power. Hit squinted slightly as he heard the apparent honest answer. Why didn't he attack me as I was completely in disarray? He could have easily finished me in that time frame. Thoughts like this were running through Hit's eyes. Just wanted to give you a scare. Broly, seemingly knowing what Hit thought, said, smiling slightly before he continued. I am going to be serious from now on. In the exchange just now, Broly had to cover his chest with his soul power to prevent any injuries. Now he enveloped every part of his body with his soul, ready to go all out. Hit, inwardly stunned by the statement, put on his stance again before he spoke out, so will I. The determination and desire to fight in his voice was obvious. An assassin as a job, a warrior by heart. Broly's smile grew wider as he heard that. The tension in the atmosphere reached its peak, and as if they had rehearsed it, they both started running towards each other at the same time. They met in the middle with a punch. The space seemed to bend inwards towards the collision. The world was silent for a moment. Bang! The ground was crushed, extending kilometers outwards within a few seconds. The smooth orange surface beneath the crushed earth was being revealed in an instant, but the disaster didn't stop there. The space in several places around this planet was bending inwards or tore completely, leaving behind tears in the space and time continuum. The collisions between the two sent waves of energy into the universe. The near solar system group was affected greatly as they were being pushed out of their orbit by the aftermath. These two really didn't hold back anymore as they clashed with each other. The only reason the whole universe wasn't in a turmoil was because of their precise control that prevented their clash from causing too much damage. With time, the damage actually decreased as Broly was getting used to this kind of high-level engagement. The assassin always used precise control and had no problem in going all out without destroying an entire solar system in the process. An entangled purple and a green light could be seen speeding through the universe. They directly headed towards a near solar system. Broly had gripped Hit's head hard and swung him towards the nearest planet. It was a giant planet that would put Earth's sun to shame. With the great momentum, Hit wasn't able to stop and directly entered the atmosphere of this planet. As soon as he entered, he was assaulted by several lightning. The whole planet was covered in clouds, and instead of water, lightning was raining onto the ground. Broly followed up closely on Hit as he shot several key blasts at Hit's falling body, making him accelerate even faster to the ground. Hit crashed into the ground. His body wasn't embedded deeply, only a few tens of meters, as the ground was unusually hard after being tempered by the never-ending lightning. Before he could get out, a flickering shadow was being cast, blocking the light coming from the storm outside. He couldn't react and was directly punched further into the ground. By the second punch, Hit's body disappeared as he jumped through his dimension and passed Broly. But it was like he had tracker on his body. As soon as he disappeared, Broly had already turned around to catch up with Hit. Exiting his dimension, he immediately crossed his arms and blocked the incoming attack. Hit's body flew into the sky and was met with several lightning. Obviously, normal lightning from a planet wasn't enough at all for this kind of high-caliber fighter. Even normal true emperors were mostly undisturbed by these natural disasters. Part 2. Hit saw Broly heading for him and shot several key blasts as Broly just bulldozed through the explosions, but Hit had already disappeared. Suddenly, Broly raised his hand behind his head and caught a fist. Broly's muscles were tense as he used a considerable amount to block the attack. Hit's usage of focusing his energy of his attacks into a single point was the thing that made him a dangerous foe. Although he had stopped the attack, Hit wasn't finished. Hit's other hand was shining brightly before several light beams shot out, intending to pierce Broly's body. With the close distance between the two, there was no way for Broly to dodge the attack. Broly's muscles tensed up and the energy output was released to the maximum. Burning his life force that was fused with his soul gave him an additional boost. The energy beams collided with Broly's back, but instead of piercing through the body, the light beams dispersed like water splashing against rocks. While Hit was stunned by the sudden increase in power, Broly did a backflip over Hit and kicked Hit away with all his might. Hit was hurling through the clouds and headed for the ground again, but this time he was able to stop. His head was buzzing from the kick and a tiny wound was left, but Hit was quickly to reorientate himself again. He was a resilient being that could even take on punches from a Super Saiyan god with ease. It wasn't surprising for Broly that his previous attacks didn't amount to much damage. Broly outstretched his hand and pointed his fingers at Hit, who was already advancing towards Broly. His fingers started to glow until they each shot out a thread-like energy beam. The beams headed towards Hit in a wavy motion, making it difficult to predict from where the attacks were coming from. Hit leaped through time and avoided several attacks, but Broly could well see where and when Hit would disappear and reappear. Broly's vision was just a perfect counter for Hit's ability. Of course, one could also just use their reaction speed and pure strength to overcome this ability like Jiren did in the Tournament of Power, but Broly was well aware that he was nowhere near this kind of power. Broly put up another hand and shot 5 more of these light beams. After several misses, Broly managed to injure Hit. However, his body was too tough to actually pierce through. Any other being would already be riddled with holes. Seeing the ineffectiveness of his attacks, he decided to step up his game. He raised his arms above his head, and in a second, a large amount of energy gathered above him. In a whirl, the energy sphere above accumulated more and more energy. After getting rid of the other energy beams, Hit finally saw the energy that was hanging above Broly in the sky like a green sun. The clouds and lightning were swept into the gigantic energy sphere and turned into energy for the sphere. Hit's countenance changed as he sensed the immense power. If this attack landed on the planet, it would destroy the planet, and they both would be enveloped by the explosion. Broly swung down his arms, and the energy sphere shot towards Hit. Hit felt the deadly energy coming from this attack. He couldn't help but panic. He urged the energies in his body and headed straight for the energy sphere. With all his effort, he used his time skip to pierce through the energy sphere. He needed to extend the time, otherwise he would emerge in the sphere itself. Hit used all his effort to overcome his previous limits for his time duration. He emerged on the other side of the sphere behind Broly and directly chopped at Broly's neck. With the huge expenditure of energy, Broly was slightly exhausted and couldn't react in time. His boy shot towards the ground following the energy sphere. Hit immediately escaped as the sphere crushed itself into the planet. After a moment of silence, the huge sphere detonated. Hit was almost swept into the energy, but with his time skip ability, he was able to escape the area of influence. The star-sized planet exploded and ripped apart time and space around it. Part 1. Chapter 189. Miss Hit looked at the explosion from outside the solar system. The star that the planet used to revolve around was completely thrown out of the orbit, as were the other planets. These heavenly bodies were thrown in multiple directions, never able to become a solar system again. The explosion was so devastating, Hit was certain that Broly would be dead. Or was he? Although Hit couldn't believe that Broly was able to survive this, he stayed and watched the explosion fade away. He wanted to see if Broly had somehow managed to survive this. He also kind of hoped he had survived, as it would mean that this mission might be his first failure since he became an assassin. He wasn't called Never Miss Hit for nothing. Miss wasn't a word in his vocabulary, but if Broly was able to survive this, Hit wasn't certain he could kill him. This situation of a potential failure was something he wasn't confronted with for a long time. He thought that besides the gods, no one was able to contend with him in the slightest. The explosion faded away and nothing but debris was left behind. I seem to have overestimated you. Hit shook his head as he didn't bother looking for Broly's body. Unprotected, it would have been pulverized in the explosion in a split second. Guess that's it. Sigh. Was a fun fight. Hit looked at his hand before clenching it. He felt it. He was able to overcome his limits and grow stronger in this fight. He still had room to improve. Maybe he would be able to fight even the gods. They weren't invincible after all. They were exceedingly powerful but not almighty. With newfound ambitions, Hit headed out to become even stronger than before. Without hesitation, he turned off his communication device, with which he received his contracts, and headed out for training. Never would he have imagined that he would start training again. He was already over 1,000 years old, but he could still improve. A new, and at the same time old desire was blazing in Hit's heart. What he didn't know was that he had indeed failed. Miss. The word carried a distant concept with it for this legendary assassin, but unbeknownst for him that day he had missed his shot. He failed his first mission against a Saiyan that popped up out of nowhere. Huh? What is that? An information gatherer was currently flying around a planet that had a huge crater on one side that extended for kilometers. The strange thing about it was that beneath the layer of dirt, a smooth orange surface could be seen. He had first thought it was lava, but it was solid. It wasn't moving at all. After sending the information of what he was seeing to the headquarters, more ships from the Universal Intelligence arrived one after the other. They encircled the planet, and some were shooting gigantic harpoons at the planet's crust. It looked like they were preparing to move this planet. An idea that seemed to be too absurd, but strangely, the planet-sized object was indeed slowly being dragged away. Before they could move away far, however, a figure appeared on the surface. It instantly gathered the attention of several ships. They quickly scanned the face of this injured figure, but the system only returned that this person wasn't in their database. An unknown being had suddenly appeared on the planet. What was his purpose of coming here? Did he really want to make an enemy out of them? Every idiot would know just by looking at their equipment that they weren't weak by any means. The figure was Broly, who had disguised himself with a bit of magic. He looked at the several ships that tried to bring away the Super Dragon Ball. With a wave of his hand, he released a devastating ki attack and instantly annihilated all the ships around the planet without leaving anything behind. Without waiting for more ships to arrive, Broly pushed the giant Dragon Ball towards the spot he had picked out. There was not much distance towards the destined coordinates. He would arrive soon. Before he initiated his attack, he had already noticed the ship that approached the Dragon Ball. Seeing the ship call upon others to take away the Dragon Ball, Broly knew that he had to hurry back and hide the Dragon Ball as soon as he could. He knew of the assassin's pride and he wouldn't easily let go of his target, so the best option was to fake his death. He had already accounted for a situation where he had to leave, which was why he never used his spatial abilities to gain an advantage in the fight. Otherwise, the assassin might consider that he had escaped. With the explosion, he deceived every eye that might have watched his actions and was able to retreat back to the Dragon Ball with a simple teleportation. Obviously, there was the option that Hit wasn't able to overcome his limits in the end, but then he would have only been injured. Part 2. There was no way for Hit to die to something like that. He was a god-tier being after all. Broly himself could have survived the explosion if he used his new form and all his other powers to create barriers over barriers around himself. If it came to that situation where Hit was only injured, Broly would have abused the shit out of illusions and mental attacks to get rid of Hit, which would delay his return even more. Now most beings in the universe would think he had fallen by the hands of the legendary assassin and he was able to return faster. Who would doubt whether he was really dead if they confirmed the fact that Hit had indeed taken on this mission? After several hours of flying through space, he had finally arrived at the seemingly empty space. In Broly's vision, however, the chaotic energies were revealed to his eyes. Without hesitation, he kicked the planet-sized Dragon Ball towards the spot. After thrown inside the spot, the Dragon Ball vanished completely. Broly didn't bother with it anymore and teleported away. While Broly was dealing with the Dragon Ball, some news had spread across the universe. The Saiyans of Sadala were always highly sought after. They were mercenaries that would fight against evildoers and help out whenever they could, however. In the last few weeks, news of a coup had made itself known. On one side, there was the king, his loyal subjects, and the majority of the Saiyan population, and on the other hand, two female Saiyans with unfathomable strength. They called themselves Super Saiyan. Followed by several punks, they had risen up against the throne and fought for a new world order. The king had called back his soldiers in an attempt to stop these two, but no one was able to contend against them. Their golden glow when they transformed had awed many and called upon the Saiyans' instincts of respect for the strong. They were out to change their previous policies and tried to appeal to the Saiyans' ambitions like Broly did with them. As time went on, more and more Saiyans joined their ranks. Although the majority of intelligent beings in the universe were in the dark about it, these events didn't go unnoticed by the true powerhouses. Many wanted to help them out and stand on the king's side, but those that had suffered under the Saiyans hard made sure to suppress the opposition. They were delighted by the infighting and wanted to stir up some more trouble. Lord Frost was one of them. Although he worked with them on several occasions, he wasn't too pleased with them. They seemed to get stronger with time, and now something like Super Saiyans had appeared. This would completely throw out the balance of power. He couldn't help but want to destroy them. If they grew stronger, they would disrupt his business plan for the upcoming wars, and no matter which side these Saiyans would be, it would be his loss. With these thoughts in mind, he planned to strike them hard when their forces were exhausted because of the civil war. Part 1. Chapter 190. News. What did you say? That's impossible. Kale's agitated ki threw away the Saiyan that reported the news to her. Kale wanted to vent her emotions on that pitiful Saiyan but was quickly stopped by Caulifla. Caulifla grabbed the wrist of Kale and stared into her eyes with a stern look. Don't. You know that we are at a critical point. We can't afford to lose you now. You know he would want it too. After all the time together, Caulifla was well aware what Kale wanted to do right now. After hearing that their master had fallen to the legendary assassin, Caulifla was barely able to stay and not search for this assassin. If she felt that way, how would Kale feel about this news? Indeed, she wanted to head out and hunt down this assassin. After being held back and forced to calm down by Caulifla, she thought about her next moves. Looking back, they had already realized that Broly had yearned for a Saiyan empire. Although they were young, they weren't stupid. After the months of political schemes, they had realized that Broly was nurturing them for this purpose. Even though they knew this, they didn't mind. They themselves felt the same way about the current state of their race. They wanted a glorious future, not the status quo. Their plot for the throne was something their master wanted, but also what they wanted. He would be disappointed if they abandoned what they had built for revenge that they couldn't get. Hit wasn't an enemy they could hope to beat, at least for now. With that in mind, they headed out to get more supporters for their cause. They couldn't just kill the majority of Saiyans. That would only delay their rise in the universe. They had to convince them, so they would join their ranks voluntarily. Broly had heard news about the current situation on Sadala, but he already depicted the outcome. He had also guessed that many emperors might try to strike Sadala during the infighting, but in Broly's eyes that would be a good thing. The stronger the common enemies for the Saiyan was, the more they had to rely on the strong individuals in their midst. In Broly's eyes, the outcome was already set. The only one who might present a problem would be Frost. With his sneaky character, it wouldn't be absurd to think that he would approach the two Super Saiyans, only to stab them in the back. He had already warned them about this Frost demon. What they did with that information would be for them to decide. He didn't worry too much about that mess as he had his own stuff. He was on the way for the headquarters of the Universal Intelligence. Since they were considered to be a neutral force, they never bothered to hide it, but of course they still had several hideouts. After seeing them try to carry away the Super Dragon Ball, he began to be suspicious. Although they seemed to have come for him, they were only foot soldiers who didn't need to be filled in on the plans of the higher-ups. Considering that Kampa showed a lazy attitude in the series, it could well be that he had ordered this organization to gather the Dragon Balls for him. The only reason for him to personally enter Universe 7 in a later date was probably because of the fact that if a mortal had crossed over, he would have been immediately killed by Beerus. One that was Broly's speculation, but to confirm that, he still needed to confront this intelligence agency. If he wanted to know if they knew of these wishing orbs, or even hold on to more of them, he needed to catch a big shot. While he was hitchhiking a red meteor towards their headquarters, he was training arduously to achieving the full potential of his Super Saiyan powers. He also did some preparation for his emotional control when he would transform into the Golden Ape form in the future. He was transforming into an Oozaru and used his Super Saiyan powers to almost transform into a Golden Ape before stopping and stabilize being at the verge of transforming. For that reason, from time to time a giant ape that would glow green could be seen on a meteor. Although it looked exceedingly savage, it was calmly sitting cross-legged without moving a centimeter for several days. While training in the form of an Oozaru, some of his powers had leaked and noticed by some true emperors. They were astonished that an emperor-level being dared to boldly announce his entrance. Of course, they didn't know that Broly's power had been mostly blocked by a magic barrier. For them, he was only a weak emperor seeking death. Without thinking too hard about it, they headed out to teach this emperor a lesson. In this galaxy, 7 true emperors resided and ruled over parts of it. The true emperors became more common. The closer one got to the headquarters of the Universal Intelligence. Powerful being gravitated towards this force. Part 2. Because of the high numbers of powerful beings, they weren't able to rule over large territories as they had too much competition. After noticing this weak emperor's intrusion, 3 of the 7 wanted to have some fun and directly headed out to end this ignorant fool. In just a few hours, they finally saw the giant ape that was residing on the meteor. Without hesitation, they stepped out of their ships and approached the meteor to land. After coming in the periphery of several kilometers, they were assaulted by a violent key storm. Without being able to withstand the force, they were thrown on the ground. They were shaken to their core. How did they not sense this previously? This power could crush them in an instant without them being able to resist in the slightest. They didn't want to stay there anymore and tried to fly away, but they were like flies without wings. Their power was just too weak to carry them away from this pressure. Suddenly, they felt the ground vibrating. With every second, a booming sound that sounded like giant footsteps came closer. Only one other being was on this meteor. How could they not understand who was heading their way? They tried to call out for their ships, but no response returned. 2 even jumped crazily while waving their arms, but their ships remained unmoving as if they weren't able to see them at all. Indeed, Broly had noticed them long ago, and even as an Oozaru, it was child's play to use some illusions to deceive some lowly subordinates of some random emperors. After a huge shadow was being cast above their head, the pressure they had felt just a moment ago disappeared. One of them quickly came out of his shock and tried to jump and fly away. The moment his feet left the ground, a giant palm slapped him into the ground. Like a fly, he was instantly crushed into a bloody mess. The other 2 were horrified seeing this. Broly only glanced at them and yawned. With that slap, he had quickly read his mind and already understood the situation. He didn't want to spend too much time with these fools and quickly squashed them beneath his feet. He then shot a key wave out of his mouth and annihilated the ships that were flying beside his meteor. Afterwards, he went on with his training, but unfortunately for him, several more emperors wanted to teach him a lesson. Every single one of them had disappeared afterwards, never to be heard from them ever again. A mythos started to spread among the emperors of a deadly giant ape on a red meteor that would bring death and destruction. It lured in the experts and killed them one by one. The surface of this meteor was covered with the blood of its victims, hence its red appearance. No one knew why this beast was going around killing these experts, and no one had an interest to investigate it. After all, who would voluntarily go on a suicide mission? Broly didn't know that he had created a myth of a giant ape that rode a red meteor. A giant ape that would universally be known as the bringer of death in the near future. 2. A god of death, worshipped and feared by many, was born. Part 1. Chapter 191. Rumors. Heard any rumors lately? A guy in a big cloak sat at the counter in the local inn. He asked the barkeeper for any information just out of boredom. The barkeeper thought for a second before responding. Here, take a look at this. Some of the true emperor's men came by and left this bounty letter. The barkeeper fished out a yellowish folded paper with a seal on it before giving it to the cloaked man. Without saying anything further, he continued to wash the cup he was holding for the umpteenth time. The cloaked man was speechless as he looked at the paper in his hand. Why do you still use paper? In which century do you live in? He thought before shaking his head. He unfolded the paper and read through it silently. Bounty by order of Ignadol, to all able-bodied men and women of the Drito Galaxy. A god of death flying past the Styx River on a meteor has been luring and killing true emperors and their subordinates. A reward will be offered to anyone who kills this beast. A god of death? Impressive title. The man squinted slightly after looking at the drawn picture. Isn't that an Oozaru? He mumbled to himself. He stood up and dropped some crystals onto the counter, pocketed the bounty before leaving in a hurry. The barkeeper followed him with his eyes and caught onto a tail that was barely seeable underneath the long cloak. Broly was slowly walking with his hands in his pockets into the headquarters of the Universal Intelligence. He passed the security guards and the so-called top-notch spies and information gatherer. Hidden from the eyes of the general guest, there were several beings who possessed extraordinary strength or surveillance abilities. The Universal Intelligence was aware that if someone dared to make trouble in here, the guards would only pose as cannon fodder. However, even these hidden experts didn't move out as Broly walked past the security and took the elevator up to the higher floors. It was like they were purposely ignoring him. But of course, they just weren't strong enough for Broly to make a move except for using illusions. After the years of training illusions and other mental attacks or deceiving techniques, coupled with his tremendous supply of magic power and his vision of truth, his illusions became exceedingly strong. Although his vision of truth didn't directly influence the illusion's power, he still could use it to make it blend in more seamless with reality. He was confident that he could completely fool anyone that was below his strength or was insensitive to magic. Anyone above his strength would need tremendous amount of magic power to deceive, which would make the fluctuations more obvious as he wasn't as proficient in handling an amount of power where he had to go to his limits. Of course, that also meant that as Broly grew in power, it would become easier to control it. The elevator didn't take long to bring Broly to the highest floor. The door opened, and he stepped outside. There were several men in suits on the sides of a long floor that looked straight ahead without saying anything. The fluctuations coming from their bodies were obvious. Broly opened the giant metal door in front of him and was directly greeted by a man sitting on a giant couch while being pleasured by several girls. Stunned by the cliché sight, Broly shook his head in disappointment. It was obvious that this man was just a puppet to attract anyone's attention with ill intent. He still went ahead and read his mind as he could get the information of when a middleman would appear. After taking in the memories, his face changed into a disgusted expression. Opposite to his prediction, this man was actually a co-founder of this organization. His brother was the actual one that led it to the success it now was, while remaining unknown to everyone. Everyone thought that they were communicating with this dipshit, but this one was only interested in fooling around. He didn't even know where his brother was, however. It seemed like he doesn't even want to know as he had too much time playing with his slaves and was barely involved in the agency's business. Broly was tempted to just kill this fool as he had seen the horrendous sights in the memories of a man with too much influence and time on his hands. He shook his head and dismissed the idea as this would only make the brother more cautious and maybe make him hide the Dragon Balls. He would just come back at a later date or give Kale and Caulifla some information. He ignored him and walked out again before finding a remote place to teleport away. He appeared on the red meteor again and started to think of a place that would most likely be able to safely keep the Dragon Balls. His eyes dimmed slightly as he came to a realization. Part 2. If they really collect the Dragon Balls for Kampa, which place would they bring it to after they had found one? Of course, it would Kampa's planet. How the hell would he know where his planet is, and even if he knew, would he be able to steal it? Broly was getting a headache as he thought about it. He could only hope that like Beerus, Kampa was sleeping. Maybe he would only wake up after the Dragon Balls in his universe were all gathered. Without further ado, Broly headed for another planet that he knew the location of, or at least hoped was the same. He would just gather the Dragon Balls from the local planet Namek. With them, he would just wish for the location of Kampa's planet, and then try to steal the Super Dragon Balls. He redirected the meteor's direction towards planet Namek and continued his training. He didn't know why, but he became increasingly attached to this meteor. He continued to train for his preparation towards Super Saiyan 4 and for the new form. He had almost mastered it as he only grew in size for a few centimeters now. He estimated that he would need another month for him to achieve complete mastery over it. As for the golden ape form, or in his case the green ape form, it seemed to be easier to master than the new Super Saiyan form. He wasn't like Goku, who couldn't even control his normal Oozaru form, or Vegeta, who hadn't transformed into an Oozaru for decades. He was confident that he could keep his conscience as a Super Saiyan Oozaru, but to then shrink in size would be another hurdle altogether. In fact, it doesn't seem to be much different to what he was doing with the new Super Saiyan form right now, only on a completely different scale. This weren't a few dozen centimeters after all. A week passed as he continued to train. Suddenly a figure had once again entered his area of influence and was swept to the ground. Broly only sighed as he got up and walked towards it. The strength of this being wasn't low for the standards of this universe, as it was nearing the upper limits of a normal emperor, but for Broly it was just too weak. He steadily walked towards the figure as an Oozaru ready to step on him, but he froze for a moment as he looked at the cloaked figure. A cloak wasn't able to hide anything from Broly's vision. He could very well see the tail on this man. Not only could he see it, but he also felt the similar energy of a Saiyan. Unbelievable. Didn't they evolve to not having a tail? How could one appear right in front of him? Broly didn't kill this Saiyan right away, but waited for the man to speak up. He had already suspected that his giant ape form would create some notoriousness, but he didn't really expect for anyone to recognize it. Even the Saiyans don't remember it. The only ones Broly could imagine having knowledge about it would be the gods. Either way, it was obviously not a coincidence that a Saiyan with a tail landed on his meteor. Broly helped the man to stabilize himself by dispersing the natural pressure that he emitted. With the pressure dispersed, the man was finally able to breath up. He looked at Broly, who was currently an Oozaru with a tinge of green, in front of him with widened eyes. I knew it. You are the legendary Super Saiyan. Part 1. Chapter 192. Pair Broly looked at the Saiyan from the bottom up. That Saiyan seemed to be in touch with the Saiyan history about the Super Saiyan, but he himself had never seen this Saiyan before. Maybe he wasn't important to the Dragon Ball series? And who are you? Broly's icy voice sent shivers down this unknown Saiyan. Oh, I am Pair, nice to meet you. The Saiyan stretched out his hands, trying to shake hands with the giant Oozaru. What a dumbass. Broly thought as he looked down on the Saiyan, who was awkwardly retracting his hand. Silence filled the surroundings as Broly observed the young man in front of him. Although Broly was certain that he was a Saiyan, he still felt different from a normal Saiyan. If Broly hadn't seen him struggle against the pressure he was giving off, he might have thought he is another type of legendary Super Saiyan, but wouldn't he have said, "You are also a legendary Super Saiyan?" or something similar? Broly slowly reverted to his base form, while Pair watched on with a shocked expression. You are? Bro Dash? HM? You know me? In reflex of that exclamation of that Saiyan, Broly observed him closely with his vision of truth. He pried deeper into the body of this Saiyan, who suddenly stepped back warily. Did he sense that? Broly thought as he looked at the Saiyan's expression that tried hard to calm down. Pair gulped down. This dude didn't go to acting school, that is for sure. Broly smiled slightly as he thought of teasing him for a bit. Didn't I just ask you a question? Why aren't you answering? Are you trying to mock me? Broly's voice got rougher, and he filled every word with killing intent, which made this Saiyan's knees tremble. The Saiyan tried to take a step backwards, but only fell on his butt. He looks like he is 20 years old, but he is so cowardly. Should I just read his mind? I am so sorry. Sir Broly, before I was thrown in a space and time rift from the explosion of our planet Vegeta, I had heard about your extraordinary strength and I just knew that it had to be you. A lie. The explosion of Vegeta isn't enough to cause a rift that leads out of the universe, and what about knowing about my extraordinary strength? Not even my parents knew of it. Is he from another timeline? At least, it seems like he has more knowledge than he wants to admit. I had wandered all around the universe to find a way back and had finally found a planet called Sadala with other Saiyans still alive. I was on my way towards it before I came across this rumor of a strong Oozaru. Another lie, mixed with some truth. Broly decided to play along and smiled heartfully. So, you are a Saiyan from planet Vegeta. I hate to break it to you, but you should have already guessed it, but we are currently residing in another universe. What? I would have never known. The Saiyan shouted, exaggerated. The corners of Broly's mouth twitched unnoticeable. Is this guy for serious? Yeah, I know, right? But it has some good things. After I came here, I was taught to control my temper, and let me tell you, I was really bad. Pear was stunned hearing this and only nodded his head. No wonder. He can converse normally. Pear stopped quivering for a considerable amount. How did you get to this universe? Pear asked Broly as he searched for a spot to sit down. Oh, you won't believe it. Even I would never thought I would get here in such a bizarre way, however. I will tell you the story another time as you wouldn't understand it, without getting to know all the people involved. I will introduce them to you someday. Oh, I see. Pear blinked innocently, and didn't ask anything further down that road. Maybe it was the first impression, but everything this Saiyan did or said made Broly want to puke. Something about him made Broly utterly disgusted. I am currently heading towards Namek. I heard some interesting rumors, and if they are true and I might get back to our universe. Broly decided to change the subject and told him about his destination. Rumors? What kind of rumors? Pear asked with a fake, surprised expression. He was being read like a book by Broly. Well, anyone would be hard-pressed against someone who, if he locked onto you, could sense even the tiniest fluctuations of any energies and even hear your heartbeat. The strange thing was that Broly could see everything clearly with the exception of his soul. It was like a fine barrier with an illusion on top of it had been put around it. Broly chuckled slightly. You will see when we are there. I am going off and train a bit more. If you need food, we can make a stop somewhere on the way, just say a word. Broly then turned around while keeping close watch on the Saiyan behind him. He saw an expression of contempt and a greedy glint in that Saiyan's eyes. Part 2. He chose to ignore it and went on with his training, however, just a very suppressed version of it as he still kept being vigilantly. While Broly was training, it looked like Pear was watching Broly, but in fact he wasn't looking at him at all. In his eyes he was looking at a game-like panel. Name, Broly. Power level. Age. Race, Saiyan. Bloodline, Legendary Super Saiyan. Transformations, Oozuru. Techniques. This had never happened before. Usually if the difference in power was too great, there would be question marks for the points, transformations, and techniques. If the bloodline was unique as well, there would be question marks as well, but now not even the name was undoubtedly confirmed. How strong was this version of Broly? After he had taken over the body of this universe 6 Saiyan, he had absorbed every Saiyan around him and grew tremendously powerful by purifying his Saiyan bloodline. It was unlucky that he didn't take over a Saiyan on Sadala, but a savage survivor of the ancient civil war. It was a remote planet with just a few Saiyans that still had their tails. If he had access to Sadala, he would have grown vastly stronger and could have just beaten up this Broly. Hell, he could have already ruled the entire universe. After finally getting off that planet, he had finally come across another Saiyan and even a legend to boot. He just needed to get the legendary Super Saiyan's bloodline and his powers would leap to whole new level once again. After absorbing the rest of Sadala's Saiyans, he would be unstoppable. The only thing to do is get Broly to exhaust himself a little bit. Just getting moderately distracted would guarantee his success. Pear looked at the floating cards hovering in his mind space. 2 in particular were shining brightly. One of them was glowing in a golden light and had the word luck carved into it, while the other was blood red and had the words absorb on it. If the 2 cards were simultaneously in effect, he was certain that he could get Broly's bloodline. Afterwards, Broly would be weakened severely, and Pear himself would only be bustling with strength. He first silently activated his luck card. It would be in effect for a week, and everything would practically fall into his lap. When the opportunity presents itself, he would absorb Broly's bloodline and become a legend. The only thing unfortunate was the fact that there was no mission for stealing Broly's bloodline. Usually his system would give him some extra rewards for going for something dangerously. Now, however, it was silent. Maybe it knew that stealing Broly's bloodline with these 2 cards would be child's play, and decided to not give him a mission. The only thing that was still there was the survive mission that he had since the beginning. HM? Why is a card hovering over that Saiyan's head? Luck? Why is it in English? Although it was somewhat blurry, Broly could still identify what was written on it. The card was golden and extended some threads outside. He observed the changes that the card was having on the space and time in this universe. It extended out into the deep universe and seemed to pull something towards Pear. Could it be? Another reincarnator with a fucking golden finger. How unfair is that? Part 1. Chapter 193. Mistake. Although Broly was observing the changes closely, he didn't let any emotions appear on his face. To Pear, Broly was deeply meditating, and even though the strength Broly was emitting was powerful, it wasn't to a degree that would make him shiver in fear. Pear was waiting for the luck card to take effect, but he knew that it would take a while. So in the meantime, he didn't have anything better to do than to go through his other cards beside the 2 he wanted to use for Broly. Broly was waiting for the effects to show as well. He was extremely interested on how the energy in the space and time threads were behaving. He was analyzing it, so he may emulate the effect himself in the future. This power was heavily encrypted and difficult to discern as almost no energy of it was wasted. Broly could barely understand its functions through the energy waves, but he could guess its function through the word luck that was boldly carved into the card. It took him several hours to analyze a part of this power. With every part he understood of its power, it got easier to understand the rest of this puzzle. It took him 2 days to understand how this card operates. During the process, he got exceedingly more disappointed. It was like he was watching a once phenomenal magic trick, only to have the simple sleight of hand be revealed step by step. Another 2 days passed, and the card finally showed its effect. Pear had a shocked expression as he looked at the giant meteor that was heading straight their way. Broly only glanced at it from the corner of his eyes. He had already seen the giant meteor when it was hundreds of thousands of kilometers away. The meteor was a solid metal ice block that would need a power that exceeded that of a true emperor to destroy it. But that wasn't all to the incoming threat. Several dozens of emperors and true emperors could be seen riding the meteor while locking onto Broly and Pear. There was even some whose strength had exceeded that of a peak true emperors. Such a force could swagger everywhere in the universe. Even Broly would normally be astonished to see such a force in one area, and not only that. They all seemed to have come with the same purpose. After knowing to what extent the card's influence towards the surrounding and the strong beings in this universe had reached, Broly had only yawned slightly. He had waited a day until the meteor was finally visible to the naked eye, and as expected Pear was secretly ecstatic. "I think they are coming for us. What should we do?" Pear asked as he looked at the meteor with a shocked expression. Broly inwardly rolled his eyes before responding, "I will take care of it, don't worry." He then stepped forward and transformed into his first legendary state. For dramatic purposes, Broly let the ground crack beneath his feet, and the storm of ki almost carried Pear away. Pear positioned himself slightly behind Broly as if he was waiting for something. Broly felt the intense and greedy stare on his back. In fact, he could see it clear as day as he was still observing Pear's every movement with utmost caution. Although the card was such a disappointment, maybe he still got an ace up his sleeve. Who knows how strong this golden finger of his was. Until he was dead, Broly wouldn't relax. On the other meteor, the weakest emperors didn't dare to make any sounds as they listened to the conversation of the strongest among them. They were currently talking about the two figures they were seeing on the red meteor of their target. After finally seeing the meteor, they had prepared themselves for battle. However, instead of the giant ape, the so-called god of death, that was supposed to be mediating on this flying rock, two figures could be seen, looking in their direction. After observing them for a while, they noticed that one of them had a tail around his waist, wearing it like a belt. The other one was wearing a large sash, so they couldn't confirm it, but seeing them together raised suspicion that they were at least working together. They quickly connected the dots and assumed that the giant ape had to be a transformation of one of these two. Although they couldn't confirm anything, who would dare to question this group, even if they made a mistake? In their eyes, those two were already as good as dead. As they were waiting for the meteor to close in, they saw a tiny green light appear, heading towards them. "Are they attacking us?" After the words were spoken, the surroundings fell into silence. After a second, they all started laughing at the attack that was shot at them from such a long distance away. The strongest of them remained silent, but still had a sneer on their face. Even their attacks would lose considerable amount of power with that much distance. Is that light getting larger? Part 2. Of course, it is getting larger. It is coming closer. So dash. The words that this emperor wanted to say was stuck in his throat. The laughter on this meteor quieted down shortly afterwards as well. The light wasn't only gradually getting larger. With every 2 seconds, the light tripled in size. Even after reaching a planetary scale, it continued to grow. They finally recognized the light as a giant energy sphere that would explode the moment the creator decided it to happen. They also felt a pull on their body towards the energy sphere. The weakest emperor was suddenly slowly levitating towards the energy sphere. No, he was being pulled towards the sphere, and although he was struggling to get away, the pull just kept getting stronger every second. Fuck. A being whose strength exceeded that of a true emperor suddenly jumped behind the meteor they were standing on and fired a ki wave at it, pushing it towards the green sphere. He knew that they had already wasted their shot at escaping and could only hope to resist. Seeing one of them jump away, pulled them out of their daze, and without exception they each followed suit and released their strongest attacks. Colorful lights filled the usual bleak, empty space as they pushed a giant meteor towards a green sun. It didn't take long until the meteor crashed into the green sun, but instead of a terrifying explosion, the sun just enveloped the meteor as if it was devouring it whole. The faces of these powerhouses instantly went pale as they saw the sphere heading their way. The one that had won didn't hesitate anymore and pulled out their life-saving trump cards that would boost their capabilities or was able to influence the space around it. Some were able to pull themselves away and escape. The survivors could be counted on one hand. The others were hopeless in front of this feat of power as they were either stuck in place or fell into the green sun. With a grand explosion that destroyed everything in its area of influence, the group was annihilated in a single instance. The ones that survived would never appear on the universal stage as they hid away in the deepest parts of the universe, fearing for the pursuit of the god of death. As Broly was supplying an energy sphere with power, Pear positioned himself behind Broly. His vicious smile and his greedy eyes were revealed to the world as he activated the blood-red card. The card appeared next to the luck card, and with a flash of blood-red light headed straight for Broly's head. This is a soul attack? Broly didn't turn around as his soul enveloped his whole body in an instant. He struck behind him without turning around, smashing the blood-red light into pieces. Pear's face froze as he looked at the twinkling lights. The lights didn't fall to the ground, but instead hovered in the air. What why is? Pear's thoughts were in a disarray. He couldn't understand what just happened. The system had never failed in its functions. He just couldn't connect the word failure with this system of his. Broly finally turned around as there was no need to supply the sphere with more energy. Was that what you were hoping for? Broly observed the red lights. Since it was destroyed and the energy leaked out, Broly could tell with a glance what this light was supposed to do. Steal my life force to power yours? This so-called bloodline purification was just a way to raise the quality of one's life force and open the seal of the Saiyan curse just a tad bit more. Broly was also directly able to tell the limitations of this power. The life force had to be similar to one's own life force, otherwise the differences would be too high to absorb and integrate it. If Broly was correct, Pear would probably need several thousand Saiyans, or someone like Kale to raise the strength of his life force significantly. Although your powers are somewhat disappointing, you are still great research material. I really want to see what is going on in your head. Broly waved his arm and a giant sword appeared in his hand. Hearing Broly's words and seeing the sword pointed at him, Pear finally came out of his shock. Without waiting for anything to happen, he activated another card that had the word escape carved into it. A blue light enveloped his whole body. The next time I see you, Broly, I will absorb every bit of your bloodline. I will surpass you and make you kneel before me. Should have killed me immediately, now your doom is already certain, Pear said with a distorted expression. He was angry, after all. He had wasted 2 epic class cards. PFFF. Ha ha ha. Broly couldn't stifle his laughter and broke out into laughter. Pear wanted to curse at the laughing Broly, but his expression changed as he noticed that, although his body was enveloped in the blue light, he wasn't moving at all. Part 3. Yeah, I already sealed this place. You are getting nowhere. Broly smiled mockingly at the pale Pear. Part 1. Chapter 194. Transmigrator Pear's thoughts were racing through his mind. He didn't know what to do. How could he get away if the place was really sealed like Broly said? Wasn't he only a mouse trapped, ready to be experimented on by Broly? Pear gritted his teeth and activated several other cards. Broly, of course, noticed the energy waves Pear's soul was suddenly emitting. Pear's muscles slightly expanded in size, and his ki rose tremendously until his ki started glowing in a golden hue. His hair turned golden as well, and his eyes changed to a green-bluish color. The power was literally gushing out of him. One didn't need to be able to sense ki to feel the changes this increase of power had on Pear. Broly could feel how some sort of power was burning up at an alarming rate. Pear would probably only have 2 minutes until his body couldn't shoulder the strain of this power anymore. The moment his transformation was complete, Pear started running towards Broly like a madman. Broly raised an eyebrow as he looked on as Pear was heading towards him. Pear directly punched towards Broly's head, who evaded it by simply tilting it slightly. Pear didn't stop as he started punching out madly, trying to hit Broly's face, but the difference in power was too great. Currently Broly was in his strongest form. He could even fight god-tier level beings. How much of a trouble could a peak emperor give him? Even after boosting his capabilities to its body's limits, he was still no match to him. Maybe he would give Broly some trouble if he was only an ascended legendary Super Saiyan, but Broly wouldn't degrade to that form. He was still waiting for Pear to use up all his trump cards. He wanted to see to what extent this golden finger could help Pear. Broly easily evaded all the attacks of him. He didn't even need to step backwards. Seeing this, Pear decided to tackle him, but Broly just jumped over his head and then looked on as Pear lost his balance and tumbled to the ground. As they were fighting, Broly's face turned into a questioning expression. Every time Pear's kicks or punches missed, his fighting rhythm would be interrupted, and he needed some time to reorganize himself. It was like Pear wasn't used to missing his attacks. Broly scratched his cheek as he didn't know if he was imagining things. 2 minutes were almost wrapped up. Seeing that his attacks didn't do jack shit, Pear turned around and tried to flee. Broly didn't bother to follow as he looked at Pear, who was running full sprint towards his invisible barrier. Without stopping and in a full sprint, Pear collided with an invisible wall, which directly cracked his skull. With a bang, Pear fell on his back dizzily. Blood was dripping down his face as the world around him seemed to spin, and it actually was. Broly was spinning him around in the air until the 2 minutes were up. Broly healed Pear's head, so he wouldn't die, then waited for a few minutes until Pear realized what just happened. With a horrified expression, he turned towards Broly and wanted to beg for mercy, but before he could say anything, Broly broke both of his legs and sealed his ki. Pear's agonizing scream filled the silent surroundings. Broly couldn't help but frown as he listened to the wails of this young reincarnator. He didn't break his legs to inflict pain, but just to make his escape more difficult. Of course, with that system of his, he would probably have more than one possibility to escape, but nevertheless, it would at least hinder him somewhat. Pear suppressed his crying as he cautiously touched his legs with trembling hands before he retracted his hands and cried for his mommy again. He didn't even hear Broly calling him. It was like he didn't even care for his life as he was too occupied with the pain. Hey. Fuck this. Broly shot a finger beam towards Pear's inner thigh. It burned through the flesh like it was nothing. The pain made Pear want to cry out again, but he was fiercely slapped in the face. His mind became dizzy again, but he could feel and taste the blood accumulating in his mouth. He spat it out, and with it some fragments of teeth came out. He now heard Broly call his name. He tried his best to suppress the pain. He realized if he wanted to survive, he had to listen to whatever Broly was saying. How old are you? Pear didn't question why he would ask something so trivial. He struggled to open his mouth, but because of the blood and pain nothing understandable could be heard. Broly frowned as he listened to the mumbling. He just raised his hand and started to use magic to heal the shallow cuts in Pear's mouth, so he would be able to speak again. After a few seconds, Pear's wounds somewhat healed. I am 17. Pear's words finally could be understood. 17? When did you learn to fight? Part 2. The tears started to well up in his eyes once more, but Broly didn't have any of it. He raised his hand and wanted to slap him with the back of his hand. Seeing this, Pear quickly answered. When I came to this universe, about 8 months. Broly touched his chin as he nodded slightly. 8 months of fighting experience. Through his golden finger, he was probably stronger than the ones around him. No need for in-depth martial knowledge. Wait. When he came here, he isn't a reincarnator but a transmigrator? 3. How and where did you come from? I used to live on Earth. I died. I was hit by a truck. A god greeted me and fulfilled 3 wishes for me. One Pear told his story on how he was bullied and had no friends or something. Broly didn't really care about that boy's life story as a loner. The story part that had intrigued him was about the god. However, the description was blurry and vague. Why did a god grant you wishes? Broly was genuinely confused as he listened to the description of that god. Because he said that he killed me by accident and felt bad. So? Broly's expression clearly conveyed that he thought that Pear was trying to bullshit him. Although Broly himself did reincarnate, he had no clue why and how that happened. Pear's story was just too unbelievable. Why the fuck would a god give a shit for accidentally killing you? Doesn't he have better things to do than to appease to one's soul? And didn't you say you were hit by a truck? Did that god accidentally place that truck there and accidentally arranged it the way, so the driver wasn't able to react in time? Besides, wouldn't it be much easier to just revive you again in your universe? Why would he feel the need to comply with your wishes and bring you to a completely different universe? After all, it seems like he only cares that he made a mistake, not that he killed you, and not about you as a person. I don't know. Pear was at complete loss of words at Broly's little rant. Broly, I am truly sorry. I didn't mean anything I said when I was trying to escape. I was only frustrated, I swear. I just miss my home and my lonely mother. I wanted to gain power as quick as possible to get back. Broly constantly nodded while Pear was speaking. Yeah, right. Don't worry, these unanswered questions about this god of yours will be answered by me. But to do that, I need you. I will start with your body, don't want it to fall to dust or something after I started with your soul. This will be tremendously more painful than some broken bones, but I believe in my healing abilities. I don't care about that god, please. I don't want to die. Broly looked at the pale and terrified expression of Pear. Nothing personal, kid. Well, actually it is, but yeah, you have some tough luck, and don't worry, you still have some days left. Broly raised his sword and started guiding it as if it was a scalpel. Part 1. Chapter 195. The System, HM. It seems like your body is. Broly paused slightly as he looked into the open ribcage in front of him with squinted eyes. Just a normal Saiyans body. No anomalies about the organs, veins, or any other part of your physical self, so it has to come from your soul. Of course, your life force is qualitatively on a higher level than normal Saiyans, which strengthens your body as a whole, but you don't have any mutations to speak of. It seems the sole reason your strength rivals a peak emperor's is because of the absorbed life force. Broly then proceeded to take out some organs to have a better look at the navel area. The quality of your ki is subpar compared to your life force, which is the reason you couldn't turn Super Saiyan naturally. Obviously, now that you are crippled, you won't ever turn Super Saiyan, which you probably already knew when you activated those cards. Broly then looked at Pear's face. The tears on his face had already dried up. His eyes were dim like a man who already lost hope and just wished for the salvation called death. Not that you not being able to turn Super Saiyan matters anymore. You will die soon anyway. Broly paused before pointing his sword at Pear's head. The sword started glowing slightly before Broly began moving towards Pear's scalp. This is going to hurt much more than what you have experienced until now. For the first time since Broly spoke, Pear's eyes flickered, listening to what he was saying. Despair, fear, and regret had already filled his mind. He just wanted to die, but he couldn't even say that with his damaged body. The screams that had already died down after the initial start of the examination once again returned to fill the surroundings, this time as a mumble. The barrier that had been put over his soul was easily cut by the first sword. As soon as a small slit appeared on the barrier, something seemed to squirm inside. It looks like if he just opened it, his soul would directly try to flee. So instead he put a barrier of his own into the open spot and slowly fused it with the already existing barrier, to make the soul think that its barrier was still standing. He cut away more of the barrier and replaced it with his own. After a while, when he replaced the barrier of the soul, Broly didn't see the soul in its usual form as a ball of light or the rare cases of strong souls that mimic the physical appearance. No, it was a ball of light indeed, but attached to the top of the soul was a red-black clump of meat which had something like blood veins extending out of it and wriggling through the ball of light. Impulses of light were moving from the soul through the veins towards the meat clump. Broly could feel the flow of energy and immediately recognized it for what it was, a parasite. This thing was absorbing the energy that the soul was producing and had access to, like his ki and life force. It wasn't taking a lot, just enough to condition the soul to be in a constantly weakened state and the changes in his body to be unnoticeable. The disgusted feeling that he had from Pear was now intensified after this thing was revealed. Now he knew that it was just a natural reaction from his soul towards such a parasite. His soul was clearly trying to stay away from it. Of course, this feeling wouldn't make him turn away, not after he was done with his experiments, at least. Broly skillfully wielded his sword as he stabbed and cut at his subject. He was quickly able to identify its nature. Without a host, this parasite would immediately wither away and die. At least the parts he had cut out of Pear's soul. It was really difficult to not damage Pear's soul too much, but he couldn't help it as the parasite was deeply intertwined with it. The source of Pear's power was also discerned after a few tests. It was using a part of Pear's soul, life force, and ki to create powerful and strange effects. Broly knew that it was barely wasting any energy, but the effect it was creating through this tiny amount of energy was unproportionally great. He didn't know how it was doing it as it was processed inside the parasite. If I know how it is using it, then my powers would get even more powerful, and since I am not sharing it with another creature, I would have a lot of energy to work with. I need to dissect it. Unfortunately, he couldn't penetrate the membrane of this parasite with his vision of truth, and he couldn't just replace the membrane of this living being like he did with that barrier. Instead, he needed to open it and observe the conversion to understand it. But how could he cut it open with it not noticing it? It would probably just escape at the first moment of notice. He had thought of the Dragon Balls of Namek, but after a few tests, he noticed that it could even absorb external energies like his magic. Part 2. If the power of the Dragon Balls fell on it, would it be able to absorb it? If it did, he wouldn't know what effect it had on the parasite, but he was sure that he would be majorly screwed. The only option Broly could think of was to use soul attacks to momentarily knock it out, but he couldn't tell if it could absorb this too. Something made him extraordinarily nervous to use his soul on it. Previously, he had just enveloped his body and fused his soul with it to destroy the attack that was coming at him, but if he used his raw soul power to attack it directly, who knew if it could absorb it? Since he was absorbing Pear's soul, it was likely that it could, but Broly's attack couldn't compare to voluntarily providing it with energy, now could it? He hesitated shortly before making up his mind. He fused his soul with his body to prevent providing the parasite with a target. He extended his finger, and a small beam of soul power shot out. It penetrated the barrier and directly landed on the parasite. The moment his attack landed on the parasite, it vanished. Broly's eyes couldn't hide the shock that he was feeling. His heartbeat accelerated and was loudly thumping in his chest. He was alert to the fullest. Nothing of God-tier level speeds could escape his vision, especially with his vision of truth compressed to a few meters as he did just now. With all this, he still didn't know where this parasite went. Suddenly, he saw something wriggle at the bottom of his eyes. From the finger he had shot his soul attack was a much smaller version of the parasite that was trying to get into his body. His entire body was fused with his soul, but just the spot from where his attack came from had used a bit of soul strength to turn into an attack. This tiny spot of vulnerability was used by this parasite. If it could even be called a vulnerable spot, it was a spot from where a deadly beam came out. After all, it has been a long time since Broly could feel the cold sweat on his back. Unfortunately for the parasite, the sword in his other hand was glowing slightly. Broly could see the thread of light that was coming from the sword through his veins towards his finger. Suddenly his surroundings changed, and Zeno appeared just in front of him. He talked to Broly about something of great power. Broly listened and his breath steadied and his heartbeat calmed down. His expression directly turned fierce as he swung his sword with all his might and cut the parasite in two. No illusion could cloud his vision. Seeing the parasite split in half didn't satisfy him, as he could see it still struggling towards him. It had just lost its host. Now it needed another one, and it couldn't get out of the barrier that Broly had set up with his sword. The only option for it was Broly. Broly madly swung his sword and cut the parasite in hundreds of pieces. Only after it withered away did Broly relax slightly. He extended his vision again and looked everywhere if he had missed something, but nothing had remained of it after it had withered away. He was fortunate that the parasite only had a speed advantage and was otherwise incomparably weak, which was probably reason why it had used such a weak host. This god, that Pear had seen was probably another illusion of the parasite to make Pear's soul more comfortable with its presence or distract the soul like it tried with Broly just now. Broly looked at Pear's corpse and saw the soul's energy disperse into raw potential. It couldn't sustain itself anymore without its body and the numerous holes the parasite had left it with. With a wave of his hand, Broly obliterated the body and then filled the sealed space with the power of his sword, destroying everything it touched. Afterwards, he jumped of the meteor and pulverized the meteor with another attack. This experience had left him with a bad aftertaste. He had wasted so much time without getting anything in return. The only thing this did was make Broly more sensitive towards these parasites. Even with a barrier to hide it, now he would recognize its kind instantly. Part 1. Chapter 196. Perfect Form. Broly was already looking at planet Namek, but he didn't land just yet. He just saw a giant dragon disperse in the air and knew that it would take a while before he could figure out the location of Compass Planet. Besides, after all this time, he was almost done completing his very own unique Super Saiyan transformation. A transformation with the low consumption of a normal Super Saiyan and the explosive power of a Super Saiyan 3. He was very close, which was why he found himself a moon that was revolving around Namek and started to train again. With the compression of his body, he gained a lot of strength, so much that he exceeded the strength of his third legendary state by far, but he had realized the flaw of it. He was using the same method to gain strength like the third legendary state by using all the potential of the body. He could maintain this peak of strength longer now as he didn't waste any energy through his hair. However, with every move he made, he would use up energy and run out eventually. Obviously, he could just stand still and not do anything, but what use would that be? He needed to be able to use his full strength and still not run out of energy. The reason that he was able to maintain the first legendary state indefinitely was because his regeneration of his ki was as high as the consumption of it, if not higher. So how else would he fix that problem other than by increasing the amount of energy he could generate? It was a natural ability, and like his body, it had room to grow. All the years prior, he tried to suppress it as much as he could as his body couldn't keep up, but now his body could handle it. His control exceeded his past self by a long run, and the remnant souls in his body except his own was 0. Of course, it would be too wasteful to just strengthen his ki core and just disperse the gained ki. He used every bit and forced it into his SLs to deepen the amount they could store. Then his attacks with more energy wouldn't just increase one by one with the supplied energy. The destructive power he would gain would exponentially grow with every bit of energy added to the attacks. Days, weeks, months passed. Broly's frown has gotten deeper and his body covered in more sweat than ever before. However, the fluctuations around him weren't violent as they used to be. It was eerily calm and silent. The surface of the moon was already completely smoothened by his energy. It looked like a perfect man-made sphere. The moon used to be 100 times larger, but after Broly's tempering, it was not only a lot smaller, it was indestructible to most being in the universe. Broly's green glowing hair was twisting upwards due to his ki, but there were no lightning arcs, no pressure or aura. He was like a statue hovering suspended above a perfect smooth moon revolving around a green planet. Now after 3 months, he once again opened his eyes. His eyes weren't the same as before. They seemed unusually deep and powerful, like he was filled with unlimited raw energy, and every glare would surely be as powerful than some beings' attacks. He was currently sitting on the dark side of the moon, and the only thing one could see of him were his green eyes that seemed to glow as he looked into the deep space. Slowly putting his feet down on the ground, he clenched his fists and felt the power that he had cultivated for the past 3 months. He controlled 100% of his physical stamina and ki, like he does in his third form, but by compressing this power to his normal height, he made this form 5 times stronger than the 3,200 multiplier of his third transformation. Now after strengthening the SLs and his ki core, he was able to generate enough power to maintain it indefinitely. One, it was a transformation only usable due to his natural ridiculous ability to regenerate ki and his perfect control. This was truly a perfect transformation. The perfect legendary Super Saiyan. A perfect legend. A transformation that multiplies his base by 16,000 indefinitely. Although no one could see his face except for his eyes, he was currently grinning stupidly as he felt the energy inside him. He couldn't help but feel invincible, even though he knew that this wasn't even close to being true. His hands were shaking from anticipation as he hesitated if he should go for it already. He had aimed at it for a long time. It wasn't something he would give up on, and now he could finally tackle it. He went around to look at planet Namek. He quickly scoured through the planet, but he could only find the Dragon Balls still in their stone form. He concluded that he still had time. At worst, he would need to wait another month and a few days, making it the same amount of time that would be needed to recover the Dragon Balls on Namek in his universe. Part 2. It would fit with the orbit of the planet. He returned to the spot where he had been hovering over for the last 3 months. Now standing still, he took some deep breaths before throwing away his sash to the side, revealing his brown tail. He let it loose and relaxed the muscles in it. Suddenly, at the bottom of his feet rose up a circling green flame-like key that brought a destructive energy with it. At the same time, his breathing got deeper and his heartbeat got louder as if it was trying to jump out of his chest. His muscles expanded as if they were being pumped with unlimited blood and strength. His veins were bulging, and his muscles were tense. The strain on his body was immense but nothing new. Fangs appeared in his mouth and his eyes turned red. A deep roar of a beast was coming out of his throat as the energy was getting wilder. His body was being automatically lifted of the ground with the enormous power that came with it. A pillar of energy pierced into the empty space as Broly was getting bigger and bigger. His mouth had transformed into a snout and fur covered his body. He transformed into an Oozuru. After transforming into a great ape, the green energy had enveloped his body completely. He had already trained this transformation until this point and was very familiar with it. This time he would go Super Saiyan Ape and then onwards to Super Saiyan 4. Just as he was about to transform, he remembered something and looked back at planet Namek. He had never considered failure, but now so close to his goal, he pondered again. If he indeed lost control, wouldn't Namek be doomed, even if it was only for a second? How would he then find Compass Planet or have some wishing orbs for emergencies? Thinking about this, he teleported away to the solar system where he had engaged Hit. Although the planets were thrown out of orbit, he quickly found one and landed on it. The climate was freezing without a sun warming it, but it didn't affect Broly at all. Broly concentrated and waited until he was in peak condition once again. Still in his ape form, he was on the verge of transforming into a Super Saiyan. He didn't wait any longer, and with a deep shout that shook the planet, his fur turned greenish gold. His strength rose tremendously, and the ground directly cracked and gave in beneath his feet. He almost lost balance since the ground was cracking open, but with a quick jump he stabilized himself in the air. AHM? Well, that was easy. Why? Why am I still an Oozuru? Broly questioned with his deep beast-like voice. He expected to lose control after transforming into a golden ape and struggle to resurface with his consciousness, but now he was perfectly fine from the start. He analyzed his condition and found everything to be satisfactorily. In fact, he was 10 times stronger than his third legendary state and twice as strong as his perfect legend state. Of course, he was not comparably fast, but considering his size, that was to be expected. He then prepared himself to make the next step and tried to compress his giant ape form to his normal size. Closing his eyes and steadying his breath was all he needed as a preparation. Afterwards, he tried to compress the large amount of power until he was only 2.2 meters tall. Well, that was what he planned to do, but his powers weren't willing to be compressed at all. He could feel that he could cancel his transformation, but he couldn't go further. The only thing that he could remember from GT was that Goku transformed after seeing Pan and regaining his consciousness, but he already is conscious. He thought he could turn Super Saiyan 4 now, but he couldn't. Now what? 1. Part 1. Chapter 197. Repulsion. Not knowing what to do, Broly decided to sit down cross-legged and dive deeper into his body and observe the reason why he can't compress the energy. He kind of expected some problems, otherwise he wouldn't have removed himself from the near periphery of Namek, but now he had to figure out what was wrong before he could proceed. Since his body was several times larger than his base, it would take more time to sense every change and bits of energy. Through the rough first analyzation, he didn't find anything wrong. Now he would examine his body in precise detail. With this, some days has passed before he figured out what was wrong. After coming to the realization, he only slapped his own forehead. He already knew how to achieve Super Saiyan 4. It was to fuse his Super Saiyan with his Oozuru powers. Usually he would transform into a Super Saiyan and then use his Oozuru powers in the form of Ikari to stack them on top of each other. Now he had transformed into an Oozuru and then stacked Super Saiyan on top of it. Obviously, this wouldn't give him the form he wanted. From what he had seen in the series was that Goku had first transformed into an Oozuru and then Super Saiyan. Afterwards, he somehow was able to combine them and achieve that form. He had to have forced these two powers together. Afterwards, he had probably used them together right from the start, which is probably a level higher on the difficulty scale. So instead of compressing the energy, he had to fuse them. Broly tried to discern these two powers. It took him a few more days until he finally had a vague grasp on the two powers that were slumbering deep inside. With his control over Ki and over his body, he guided these two powers into each other. They were repelling each other, and a tremendous amount of pain followed with every step he went by forcing them together. It was like forcing two magnets of the same polarity together, just that these magnets were able to destroy planets with ease. He concentrated so hard that he was once again covered in sweat. He was straining his muscles so hard that some blood started leaking out of his closed eyes and ears. The more sensitive muscles in his body started tearing apart due to his extreme effort to combine these powers, and it showed effects. Indeed, his giant Oozuru form showed signs of shrinking. However, already at the start of the transformation, Broly lost the control of one of the powers, and it was practically flung out of his grasp. The two powers immediately shot out and rampaged in his body, triggering the remaining energy as well. He instantly reverted back to his base form and spat out a mouth full of blood. He could feel several ruptures inside him. His organs were in a bad state, and his whole body gave him the illusion of trembling. He couldn't control his ki at all in the moment. Even worse was the fact that he couldn't even hold up the technique that he was using to be able to survive in space, and he was currently on a planet without an atmosphere. It didn't take much energy to keep that technique going, and to Broly it was almost as natural to use as walking, but now he was in a state where he couldn't even get up. It was like he was completely drunk without being able to function even in the most basic way. His head started to feel dizzier as the lack of oxygen was getting to him. He tried to move, but all his muscles were on the verge of tearing apart, but he knew that he had to do something. Without bothering to move, he started to use his telekinetic abilities to guide a healing capsule into his mouth. The energy of it directly started healing the wounds that were being caused, but it wasn't able to calm down the energy inside. Broly again threw another healing capsule and felt relieved seeing the energy lose momentum. Now he was able to use his Magi and life force to supply his body with the basic energy it needed to function, while also calming down the rampaging energy. He wasn't in a life-threatening state anymore. After another 3 healing capsules, he was able to force his energy to calm down completely and heal his body considerably. He laid down on the cold ground and started thinking about the failed transformation. He couldn't help but smile. The repulsion that the two energies were producing increased as they got closer to each other. Through the repulsion, he got some insight on how much power he would gain. The moment he goes Super Saiyan 4, he would be officially a god-tier level even without his soul. He also now knew what one needed to have to achieve that form: an absolute control over one's energy and body, consciousness, an extraordinary firm will, and a strong body that could actually sustain the process of transformation. Part 2. Since his energy was far more violent than Goku's, he needed an even better control than him, which would be incredibly hard to achieve. Normal ki control training wouldn't cut it, but didn't he just find out the perfect ki training? What was a better way to train to achieve a transformation, other by trying it over and over again? He didn't need to forcefully proceed the transformation, but could stabilize it in that extreme state until he was comfortable to fuse it further. He would take step after step until he could handle all the energy with its repulsion. After he was done, his control would even exceed that of Goku's after he achieved Super Saiyan 4 or the full power version of it. Although he knew how to proceed, he was already recovering on this planet for over a week, and it would be soon time to state his wish. He didn't proceed his training and teleported back to the moon that revolved around Namek. When he arrived, he saw several spaceships landing on the planet. In fact, there were already several stationed on the ground. Does someone covet my wish? Broly frowned. He already waited for several months to lend the Dragon Balls, and now some people were landing on Namek. He didn't think that anyone knew of the Namekian Dragon Balls. Maybe they were after something else, but what if they accidentally killed the creator? Without thinking further, he directly flew towards the densest crowd on that planet. He was able to see that several Namekians were cornered in one area, while some were lying dead on the ground, which looked like the warriors amongst them. It seemed even they weren't capable of fending these soldiers off. They again? Broly recognized a symbol on one of the devices that one soldier was holding. It was the Universal Intelligence symbol. Once suddenly that device was destroyed, and the soldier was then scolded by his commander. It seemed like that idiot brought some company property with him on an undercover mission. Broly was astonished to see such an idiot in an obviously elite team. The Universal Intelligence probably heard of the Namekian's Dragon Balls and wanted to use them to find the Super Dragon Ball that Broly had hid. He had also thought of that method of using the wish to directly find the Super Dragon Balls, but there was a reason why Broly suspected that it wouldn't work. He himself was able to extract himself from the normal Dragon Ball's influence. If he wanted to, he could use magic to hide himself completely. Of course, the dragon could see in the past and determine his position before he hid himself, and if he could do that, the creator could as well. If the creator, Zalama, didn't want the probably most powerful objects in the multiverse to be found easily, he would have some countermeasures. This once again showed the brilliance of Bulma, who was able to determine the locations through technology, something even the greatest magicians and the gods of destruction wouldn't necessarily be able to. All said and done, he would still try that wish himself, otherwise he would just go to Compass Planet. Part 1. Chapter 198. Unknown Hero HM? Who is that? Another one from the headquarters? Never seen that one before. Someone with such gaudy clothes is probably pretty high-ranked. These two soldiers looked at each other and came to a silent agreement. That man was walking towards their formation as if he was owning the place and was surely a high-ranked person, but rules were rules. Although he looked like someone they couldn't offend, they couldn't just let anyone walk in. One of them approached the man with the vibrant red sash and the golden ornaments and spoke in an amiable tone. "Sir, can I see your ID dash?" Before he could finish his question, his body fell forwards as he collapsed to the ground. What the f-ug? His colleague couldn't react before he too died without knowing what had hit him. Everyone below a certain threshold of strength started collapsing as this man walked past. It was as if the Grim Reaper was harvesting their souls, dying without any external wounds. One of the three strongest and highest-ranked beings were currently threatening the Namekians to reveal their Dragon Balls, or they would all die without exception. The elders were shielding the kids behind them as they were trying to buy time for one of their soldiers to get support from the soldiers in the other villages. However, they didn't know that the other villages were also being attacked and couldn't send support. The Namekians watched the soldiers in horror until a tall, muscular alien came along from behind. They saw how the soldiers were just collapsing to the ground as he walked past them. It was like he was the bringer of death. The three only sneered as they looked at the pale and shocked expression of these Namekians. They thought their threats finally showed effects, but after some time, they noticed that their eyes were fixed to something behind them. Why were they staring at the lower-ranked soldiers? They couldn't help but turn around. The sneer that was still lingering on their face changed drastically after seeing what had happened behind their back. Without exception, all their subordinates had died without them noticing. Only a single man they haven't seen before remained. You. What did you do? Who do you think you are? The short-tempered one from this trio started shouting at the newcomer. The other two, however, started to take some step backwards as they thought the same thing. If you want to seek death, then do it by yourself. How could that newcomer be someone they could contend against? He had killed every soldier without giving himself away. It was clear that this man's power had far exceeded the strength of the whole squad they had brought to this planet. They both started retreating slightly, wanting to wait until the short-tempered one in their ranks started to engage that being before escaping themselves. Although they were colleagues for a few years already and could be regarded as friends, in the face of death it was each to their own. They wouldn't hesitate to give a push if that meant to save their own skin. While the two thought of their retreat, the one with the short fuse was almost exploding with rage. He started to take a step forwards, but instead of walking, he stumbled forwards before his face collided with the ground as he limply collapsed. The other two's eyes widened in shock. They couldn't believe what just happened. The colleague on the ground wasn't far in terms of strength. In fact, he was stronger than the other two, which was also the reason why he was still alive despite being an idiot. They didn't want to wait anymore and stomped the ground as their bodies shot into the sky before they fell again like a dead bird. Without stopping, they crashed into the ground. The Namekians didn't know if they should be happy or fearful. Although he had saved them just now, they didn't know if he was to reveal himself as an even more powerful enemy. They couldn't think of a way to beat him as they thought that even the strongest soldiers on this planet wouldn't put as much as a scratch on that man. Wouldn't they just collapse like these soldiers? As they were wavering between being happy and fearing for their lives, a deep voice, which carried an unbelievable pressure with it, started coming out of that man's mouth. They were almost overwhelmed by his voice that they didn't register what he had said. After snapping out of their daze, they finally understood what he had said. After I got rid of these pests for you, I will make a wish with your Dragon Balls. There was no room for negotiations, and they couldn't do anything besides nodding to his exclamation. They knew that it wasn't a request. He was just stating a fact, and who on this planet could stop him? Part 2. The Namekians had a special ability to discern the nature of a person through their ki, but this man didn't exude any energy. At least, they couldn't sense it. After saying his words, his body vanished. They didn't know where he went, but they were sure that he was currently purging this planet from these invaders. They started breathing more lightly as they thought that they had evaded their extinction. Some sat down and wanted to rest, but before they could do so, the man once again appeared. 6 Dragon Balls that were still stone were hovering behind him as if they were being carried by invisible hands. Did he already kill them? They couldn't help but doubt this train of thought. How could any being in this universe be that strong? But here he was carrying the Dragon Balls from the other villages with him. Bring your Dragon Ball and place it here, he said as he arranged the Dragon Balls on the ground. What is your dragon called? He asked after seeing the last Dragon Ball being added to the bunch. He is called Orochi, but you can't summon it. I will translate. One of the elders that seemed to be their leader answered the man's question, and before he could finish what he wanted to say, the man spoke out. Come forth, Orochi, and grant us our wishes. The man spoke out in the tongue of the Namekians, which surprised everyone present. In the distance, several injured Namekian soldiers could be seen heading their way. This relieved them, but they knew that was just a false sense of security. The man spoke out his wish. I want to know where the Super Dragon Balls are. Super Dragon Balls? What are those, and why would he wish for their location if he already spoke to the Divine Dragon? The kids couldn't understand this as they weren't exactly aware of the abilities of the Dragon Balls, but for those that did, it was a revelation that didn't surprise them at all. This being had to wish for something that was out of the reach of Orochi and needed a more powerful dragon to fulfill his wishes. Considering that man's power, they were sure that his wish wasn't easily being fulfilled. Thy wish is impossible for me to fulfill. Then tell me the location of the god of destruction's planet. The man interrupted the dragon and directly changed his wish. The dragon hesitated for a while, as if he was contemplating if he should give out the location or not. After a short, while the dragon shot a beam at the man's head and stated that his wish had been fulfilled. Afterwards, the man disappeared without saying anything else to them. Seeing Orochi still waiting, they stated their wish before he disappeared in the sky. Their dead kin started to get up from the ground fully healed and well. They didn't know who had saved them, but they were deeply grateful. Although he didn't even ask for the Dragon Balls, with his strength he could have just taken them anyway and leave them with nothing, or even worse, kill them because they were bothering him. After he got rid of the invaders, he disappeared without claiming the other two wishes. The Namekians present were ashamed that they haven't even thanked him once. Broly teleported near the planet of the god of destruction before he landed on a planet in a near solar system. Kappa's planet was in another dimension, and it would take a while before he could enter without causing a commotion. He observed the space around him for a while. Part 1. Chapter 199. Change of plan. Broly's vision of truth pierced through the layers of space as he looked into the empty, seemingly endless space. It took him a while before he was actually able to see inside this dimension. He saw a very similar structure of Beerus planet, a giant purple inverted pyramid with a towering tree right in the middle of this weirdly shaped planet. There were several planets revolving around this planet. Strangely, the empty space that one suspected to be between the planets was filled with nebula, which were similar to the nebula released from the island, only less potent in masking. The nebula was colored in a red-purplish hue with a bright light coming from the top, shining onto the planets like a massive sun. It seemed like there was a sun, but Broly couldn't see anything resembling one. But he did see magic power whirling around there. He didn't know if these two planets of the two gods resembled each other because it was the same for every god of destruction, or because they were brothers. Broly ignored the beautiful scenery for now and observed Kappa's planet, trying to find any living creatures. He knew that Beerus had kept a talking fish as an oracle. Maybe Kappa had similar companions on this planet. Broly didn't want to be discovered by some random creature he didn't pay attention to. He found some animals rather quickly as the forest seemed to be rather normal. They were probably kept by Kappa to eat. This was a bit troublesome as he couldn't be sure if one of these beings were normal beings or a secretly powerful intelligence being, especially since he wasn't in the same dimension and was trying to steal a glance from outside. As he looked around, finally something obviously was being realized by Broly. The Super Dragon Balls were planet-sized, right? He was currently looking inside this dimension, but there was no trace of these gigantic Dragon Balls, which would mean they were stored somewhere else, or the universal intelligence wasn't working for the god of destruction. Didn't they collect the Super Dragon Balls for him? How else would he have gathered them all in the series? Weren't they working for Kappa? If not, this could only mean that after they had gathered the Dragon Balls, Kappa had somehow noticed them and claimed the Dragon Balls for himself. As he thought about it, it made some sense. Broly could somewhat guess what had to have happened to lead to that conclusion. They were probably discovered by the other powerhouses when they infiltrated the territory, which led to a grand war. A universal war would surely attract the attention of this universe's god of destruction. Gods of other universes would have probably intervened much earlier as their high mortal level might decrease. Broly didn't know what exactly was being measured by this, but it was obvious that they were controlling their universe more tightly than the gods of his or universe Six. This was obviously a good thing for him, as it would allow him to conquer his universe and mess around in it. Broly retracted his vision and shook his head before disappearing from the spot. Here, he couldn't find what he was looking for. It wouldn't be a good thing to get the attention of the highest god in this universe. After Broly had vanished, another figure appeared. A mortal was actually able to pry into the divine dimension? The voice couldn't hide the amusement the figure seemed to have from seeing a mortal reach for the place of the gods. The figure raised a hand to its chin and slightly tilted its head. A rather playful smile appeared on the figure's face. It will probably be several years until he wakes up. This will be good entertainment. Suddenly, several portals appeared behind the figure. For after the portals appeared, humanoid figures started pouring out. They all had the same look as they seemed to be made out of polished white marble. Their arms weren't normal either. They resembled a variety of different weapons instead. The numbers of arms a creature had were also different to the next. It was like every possible way of fighting was being brought to life by these creatures. The figure projected a build of Broly and spoke out, "Find and bring him to me." The figure didn't have to speak, but rather did it for fun. It seemed to haven't spoken to someone else for a long time. Some of the white figures suddenly became invisible, and then every one of them moved together like a swarm of bees. After the figure was the sole being on that planet, it disappeared as well. Broly had no idea that someone had sent several beings after his head, but he probably wouldn't care either if he knew. There were already several beings that wanted his head, but unfortunately for Broly, these white beings weren't comparable to what the rest of the universe had to offer. Part 2. Most of the universe that knew of him already thought that he had died in the exchange with Hit. In fact, it was somewhat a big topic as no one before was able to last that long against the legendary assassin. A bold, no, a reckless idea came to his mind as he pondered on how he would lure out the leader of the universal intelligence. He would have used the brother to get to the real leader, but through the memories he already knew that he had no way to make him show up through threatening the life of his brother. He would probably rather use this opportunity to take revenge on the other Saiyans. If he couldn't lure him out even with the life of his brother, what else could lure him out other than the Super Dragon Balls? That's right. He would just present the Super Dragon Ball to the whole universe and wait for them to come at him. Afterwards, he would read his mind and get the location of the other Dragon Balls. Another more cautious way would be to create another stronger Dragon Ball radar, as he still had one stored in his capsule, but that wouldn't be fun, now would it? Besides, he wouldn't just execute his plan without preparation. He still had several years to reach Super Saiyan 4, and then he wouldn't even fear Kappa. Although he wouldn't necessarily beat him, he would still be able to flee. The only one who could stop him from leaving then would be Vados, but the angles didn't move out that easily, especially as he would be a candidate to be the next god of destruction. One Broly headed towards the location of the messy space where he hid the Super Dragon Balls while looking out for a near solar system to spend his time in. Suddenly, he heard a tearing sound from behind him. He didn't hesitate and enveloped his body with his soul. He dodged by quickly flying down. He couldn't see it with his naked eyes, but he sensed the arrow that was currently piercing through the empty space. He instantly noticed the target this arrow had aimed. It wouldn't have killed him, but it had precisely aimed at his shoulder to disable his arm from the get-go. He looked at the direction from where the arrow came. He directly leaned backwards as he dodged a white sword arm aiming for his other shoulder. These two attacks were coming at him seamlessly. If they had hit, he wouldn't be able to release even half of his strength. He directly flew towards the nearest barren planet from the closest solar system. Even though he could fight in space, he was still more comfortable on ground. He knew that they were following him as he had compressed his vision to a few hundred meters, so he would be able to detect them. It was astonishing to find beings that could somewhat evade his vision. He was also able to tell that they were absolute experts, who had impeccable teamwork. Their appearance was strange as they didn't seem to have sensory organs and didn't release any life force, but there were many strange beings in the universe. This wasn't even the weirdest he had seen. Maybe they weren't even living beings, but some kind of intelligent robots, who for some reason were after his head. It appeared to be that they wanted to capture him, so in theory he had some leeway, but who would rely on that interpretation of things in this situation? It could also be that they intentionally aimed for non-vital organs, since if they did, it may trigger the sixth sense of living creatures and make it more likely for their target to escape. Part 1. Chapter 200. Capture. It didn't take long for Broly to arrive on the barren planet with his escort. While he was flying towards the planet, he had to be constantly on guard as they haven't ceased their attacks for a single moment. Just after he entered the planet's atmosphere, Broly squinted slightly as he saw several of these white creatures waiting for him. It seemed like they had prepared a little trap for him, but he wasn't afraid. For the first time in a battle, he started to use his unique transformation. His ki flared up in a noble green, and the powerful pressure around him dispersed all the clouds near him. His hair and eyes turned green as he headed straight for the group on the ground that were now heading to meet him. Every single one of them had a different look as they had either spears in hands or swords, maces or axes as arms. Some looked like angels with the massive wings behind them, but Broly could see the sharp glint of these wings as it reflected the light of this solar system's star. Broly, in his perfect legendary state, coupled with his soul strength, was already in the god-tier level of power. The first creature that reached him was looking like an angel with the 6 wings on its back. As soon as Broly was in its range, it started to swing its wings at Broly. The sharp feathers attached to the wings would easily slash through his tough skin. With little movements, Broly flew past the barrage of attacks and directly reached the unprotected chest of this creature. Without holding back, Broly punched out with his green glowing fist. The creature didn't have any time to react and was squarely hit in the chest. Just as Broly was about to move to his next victim, he had to dodge another wing attack. Broly didn't think as he closed in to land another hit on its head, blasting it to smithereens. Now it had a large hole in the chest and a destroyed head, but it still moved undisturbed towards Broly. He couldn't help but create some distance and dodge to the sides as he was welcomed by several arrows from the front and from behind. He shot several key blasts at the creature before his body moved quickly out of the encirclement. A group of 10 had tried to trap him, but with his speed that was only wishful thinking on their part. While retreating, he shot several key blasts at the group that followed him, but suddenly they stopped. Broly didn't want to wait for them and started to gather his ki, but he noticed that a giant shadow was being cast above him and the group. He couldn't help but turn to the sky to look what caused the shadow. His eyes widened in shock as he saw a swarm of these creatures blocking out the sun rays. All of them looked the same with only tiny differences. Broly could even tell that there were several creatures that were invisible. Dozens of thousands of these creatures were staring at him intimidatingly. Crap? Broly spat out while having a bright smile on his face. He had noticed that the space around him was sealed, so even with his spatial abilities, he would have no way to escape this onslaught. A swarm of powerful creatures with an individual way of attacking that didn't feel any pain upon destruction. Broly couldn't help but thank his lucky star this was truly a feast. Come on, show me what you have got, Broly shouted out as he spread out his arms. Afterwards, several hundred lightning spears, sizzling with energy, appeared behind his back. Unlimited thunder spears. The moment his words fell, the spears shot towards the swarm. A single spear pierced through several dozen creatures before it lost power. However, even with hole in their chest or heads, they appeared to be fine. Broly didn't stop as he created more and more spears as he released a relentless wave of attack, but it was incredibly hard to kill one of them. His attacks were like a drop in the ocean. After being attacked, the swarm started moving towards Broly. Broly didn't cease to create more spears as he headed into the battle himself. If he took out his sword, he could eliminate the lot of them, but after he had looked at the swarm, he finally noticed that he was being watched and he knew from where it came. This time he would take a gamble. The figure, who had opened the portals and released these robots, was watching the fight through a long staff with a crystal on top of it. Impressive. His strength had almost reached that of a god of destruction. That I have never noticed the birth of such a warrior. Interesting, the feminine voice said with a slight chuckle. Vados was currently sitting at a table where several meals were prepared for her. She was eating a bit, but was mostly paying attention to the bitter fight Broly had with these near-indestructible creatures. Part 2. Vados was calmly watching the fight until she noticed that she had finished all the meals that were on the table. She then looked at a digital clock that she started when the fight between Broly and the robots had begun. After the fight had ended, she already finished analyzing Broly's fighting style and the several techniques that he used. She was also aware of his way of thinking when faced with a seemingly impossible task. She only nodded as she saw the efforts and thrill Broly showed. He was obviously a calm thinker as he didn't panic after seeing the swarm of robots, but he also indulged himself in the fight. Instead of fleeing and succumb to their attacks, it was obvious that he decided to face them head-on. Although it was a pointless struggle, it showed his determination and joy in fighting. She closed off the communication and waited for her minions to carry him to her. While waiting for his body to be brought to her, she decided to delve deeper into his past. She wanted to know how he got as strong as he was right now. This kind of strength that was very close to a god of destruction wasn't something that can come out of nowhere. The crystal of her staff was blinking as it tried to get information of his past, but it just kept blinking. HM? Is he a time traveler? Would explain why he came out of nowhere? She didn't delve deeper into that topic. It wasn't her task to govern and judge these time travelers. This was a job for the Supreme Kai of Time. She would only need to intervene if she witnessed the crime herself. Since she couldn't find anything about Broly, she investigated the Saiyan race for a bit instead. After a while, a few dozen of her robots came back with a bloody body in hand. She put a hand in front of her mouth and ironically spoke out, "Oh my, what happened to you?" Broly could only glare at her as every single of his body's tendons and muscles were destroyed, making any movement impossible. Suddenly a robot stabbed at his hand, piercing deeply into his flesh. It instantly recognized if any part of his body started to heal. "All right, you can leave." Vados waved her hand, and the robots disappeared in a portal. Broly fell on the ground. His whole body was arching, but he didn't dare to let his life force gush out of his soul. He didn't know if it would indicate his relation to Para, that ancient civilization. There were millions upon millions of creatures in the multiverse. Surely there were creatures that had souls similar to his, right? He decided to play it safely and simulated a normal flow of life force. "I see you are an ancient Saiyan." She pointed at his tail that was seeable through his destroyed sash. Broly didn't bother trying to reply as he was utterly exhausted after that battle. "Oh, where are my manners?" Vados pointed her staff at Broly, and a light green glow enveloped Broly. His body was healing at a visible rate, and Broly could feel the potent life force that was gushing into his cells and repairing them. After only a second of that healing glow, his body was back at its peak. In fact, he was even stronger than before, due to the Zenkai boost. He stood up and slightly bowed to Vados. "Thank you for your mercy, Lady Vados." His voice was firm and steady as if he had never feared for his life. Still, his gratitude was sincere. He didn't show a too submissive behavior towards her, even though he appeared to know who she was. He also didn't seem to be afraid of her. She couldn't help but smile at the display. "MHM, you don't have to call me a lady. I am just an attendant to Lord Kampa." Broly couldn't help but inwardly roll his eyes. He still nodded slightly to her reply.